room about a couple of years or so ago, maybe a little longer, with my family. And as we sat here, we came across a lady who was planning to offer a performance in this very room. Sadly, I wasn't able to return and witness it. So this feels like a consolation prize of some sort to be able to be back here and share in your company in this space. The challenge of entering into a space that you've inhabited for a couple of days and then having to be extracted immediately is that there's always the risk of failing to connect to the mood and the tone of the space. So my hope in many ways is that I'll be able to attune my heart and my mind to the rhythm and the pace that has been yours. And if I can't, I hope that my offering will not be so disruptive that it will undo the gifts that you have received over the past couple of days. It's wonderful to be here and to be able to share. And sharing really is what I'm intending to do. Offer some reflections, some thoughts, and I would encourage you to receive them for the gift that they are intended to be. Test them, weigh them, and what is worthwhile holding to, you might want to hold on to, and what might need time to percolate, just give it the space and the time to percolate, and what is nonsense, just discard it. There will be an opportunity for us to enter in conversation later on, and that is perhaps the bit that I'm most looking forward to, because I always work on the assumption that knowledge is distributed, and therefore I look forward to hearing your own stories and your own perspectives. Thank you for sharing something of my own story and my biography. I have since stepped down from a couple of the responsibilities that I had previously held. Life is so exciting, life is so full that we can't do everything all the time. Perhaps a lesson that I need to keep reminding myself as I go. So this morning, part of my hope is to share some thoughts and reflections about questions around cultural intelligence as a lens, or as a tool rather, that we as a church can use in our commitment to create spaces where we're not simply driven by the imperative of equality, diversity and inclusion, but where we are committed to foster spaces for deep belonging and mutuality, which I think are categories that carry a slightly more heavy theological overtone than simply diversity, equality, and inclusion. And as we do so, we will need to assess something of our own stories, the stories of the spaces that we're invited to curate, always recognizing that we journey in the direction of the questions that are set to us, or questions that we set for ourselves. But we also paradoxically journey from the future, so to speak, God's future, that apocalyptic vision of the world gathered in worship before God, across its multi-layers of identity through ethnicity, language, culture, and many other layers that we can assign to it. And I want to encourage us not to lose sight of those two movements. One, we journey through the direction of the questions that we ask, but we also journey from God's future. And therefore we are compelled to embody something of that future in who we are, and more so in how we are together. We do so against the backdrop of a world that is often defined as increasingly becoming smaller, where it is very easy to be connected to bits of the world that geographically, again, even a few decades away, were completely closed for us. Many of us have become jet setters, familiar with the reality of the world in its geographic disparity and geographic diversity. And even when we're not physically traveling across the world, somehow we've invited the world into our homes through the food we eat, the TV shows we watch, the various music we listen to, the books we read. Somehow our world has been expanded, and the global reality of the world has saturated our lived reality of life. And so the question is asked, will the world, as it gets smaller, live to fulfill its promises and become more coherent? The challenge, however, is that when we start dissecting that world in relation to that question, we recognize and realize that, in fact, the world seems to be increasingly incoherent. The fractures that we live across seems to be deeper than our commitment to cross those chasms. Whether it's questions around gender, around ethnicity, political narratives, our world is increasingly challenging the dream and the aspirations of a cohesive and coherent narrative that draws us into a space in which we are able to weave together life as it ought to be, or as we wish it to be. And I don't think we need to go far from our own experiences to be able to name some of that reality. And I suspect if we were to ask each other that very question, each of us would be able to come with a litany of examples that demonstrate that fracture seems to be the normative experiences of our lives. Fracture that is not just out there, but often fracture that is deeply lived within ourselves. Fractures that shape our identities and our stories. And in the context of the churches and communities that we are called to serve, those fractures are often very alive. Those fault lines are very alive. And the tectonics keep shifting, often pulling us further apart from one another. So that's the reality that we are living across. But it is not a determinist or determined reality. So there is an alternative narrative that can emerge around or because of those fractures. An invitation for us to become agents and actors in the fostering of a different reality that we invite ourselves and others to frame their stories and their lives around. One that speaks of hope, one that speaks of healing, one that speaks of reconciliation and restoration. That I'd suggest is perhaps where cultural intelligence comes as a key tool to enable us to not just face the challenges, the fault lines that we live across, but redress the movement that has a tendency to pull us further apart and draw us deeper into life-affirming and life-giving relationships with one another. It's André Malraux, the French writer and politician, who said, I think it was in the 70s, that the 21st century will be religious, or you might translate it also as spiritual, or it won't be. I think he was insightful as we can see the evidence of how the 21st century is being shaped by religion and by some sort of a spiritual longing, and that is true across the globe. But if the 21st century is called to be religious, I wonder whether it might be true for us to assume that the 22nd century will belong to those who are culturally aware and culturally intelligent. A question that I hope we'll be able to tease each other out as we spend our time reflecting later on. And yet the reality of our time is that the leading intelligence that we tend to gravitate around is IQ, where a lot of structures and organizations tend to favor IQ or those with higher IQ. So we have a bias towards that kind of intelligence. And as we, especially in recruitment, gravitate towards people with high IQ, we soon discover that it might be helpful, particularly for those of us in leadership, to draw people not just with high IQ, but with the capacity to recognize that we do deal with people, and it might help to have the tools and the skills that enable us to negotiate the tensions of reality with people, with human beings, in a way that enables flourishing and growth. That, in many ways, leads us towards the evolution or shape of our cultures that become aware for not just the need of good IQ, but good EQ, emotional intelligence, the capacity of being able to tune into moods of the people that we engage with, and the emotions, and the capacity to adequately respond to those. And so many of us, and I hope you will agree with me and certainly recognize that in myself, although it's always dangerous to self-affirm certain things. So many of us have grown to develop good emotional intelligence. And we're quite happy to declare that we work well with people. What we often fail to add is that we tend to work well with people that are like us. So IQ, EQ, in many ways may give us the capacity to tune into the moods of the spaces that we inhabit, but they don't necessarily prevent us from the capacity to operate well in contexts that aren't homogeneous. Now, it may be also worth naming the reality that most of us are gregarious as human beings, meaning that we gravitate towards people who tend to be like us. I often invite people when I run workshops to do an exercise that is called my trusted 10 or my trusted 5 if you haven't got that much time. So the exercise is quite simple, where you invite people to name the 5 or the 10 go-to people. You then invite them to score them or mark them against a grid that contains categories such as age, religious affiliation, education level, sexuality, gender, and you could go as detailed as you would like. And what transpires in those exercises is how many of us tend to gravitate around people who give us a strong sense of homogeneity and identity. And that in many ways is natural. It is a human predilection, a predisposition to gravitate towards people who are like us That's where we have a sense of safety. That's where we have a sense of affirmation. That's where our identity is shaped. The only challenge, however, is that we don't live in a world that is only segregated. We live in a world in which the boundaries of our spaces often collide with boundaries of others' spaces. And the intersection between our boundaries and someone else's boundaries can be both a space for deep creativity or often a space for deep tension and deep fracture. I don't know whether any of you has watched the movie, I think it's called Crash, that came out in the early 2000s. I think it was around 2003 or 4. If you haven't watched it, do. It's a really good film. I think it even won an Oscar, which is a mark of excellence, if you were ever in doubt. No, not being cynical about it. So Crash was a film that was exploring life in Los Angeles, where various characters were literally, their life were colliding with each other. And there was a sense that the only interaction that they had from their respective spaces was a confrontational engagement with others. Now that might be a caricature of a certain experience and a certain expression of life, but if we were honest with ourselves, we would probably find and recognize that many of us, when our space, our vital space, engages with someone else's vital space, it often leads us into places of confrontation, places of tensions. Again, as I was saying, those places can be source either of fracture or creative spaces where new life can emerge. And my suggestion, my contention is that as we enter into those places of intersection and contention and tension, cultural intelligence can be a tool that enables us to articulate a new way of relating, a new way of defining ourselves. So how do we move from the capacity to get the mood and to respond to the mood in a way that affirms our shared humanity into a place where we are able to increasingly create spaces for neutrality and belonging. So how do we move from emotional intelligence into cultural intelligence? So the ability to work with people and lead people who are not like me is crucial, is vital. Now, I'm using the language of leadership because I recognize that many of us in this place are in roles or occupy positions that require a level of leadership. But I would also want to argue that all of us in every expression of life constantly exercise a task of leadership, whether it is explicit or not. I think that is applicable to the postures that we take in life as we engage with other human beings. And so we need in that task the ability, particularly when we do so and interact and intersect with people across cultural boundaries, across societal boundaries, to have the ability to do so with competence and confidence. If IQ is seen as relatively rigid and can be quantified, CQ, which is cultural intelligence, is fluid. It is essentially qualitative. It can't be measured, it can't be contained, and therefore it expects a level of movement. It's dynamic. And therefore, it is never a destination that we reach, but it's a destination that we constantly journey towards. The sad news is that we never quite arrive. We always labor and work towards it. It is a lot more demanding, a lot more costly, because it mobilizes the fullness of who we are. And it does so constantly, so long as we are committed to engage with humanity. Cultural intelligence refers to the skills that one holds to relate and work effectively in culturally diverse situations. It's the capability to cross boundaries and prosper in a world that is multiple and complex. The idea of crossing boundaries, I think, is in itself deeply rooted in our Christian identity. There is something both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament of a depiction of humanity constantly on the move and humanity constantly moving across boundaries, whether cultural, whether philosophical, whether political or geographic. There is that sense that as humanity we are a pilgrim people constantly on the move. And I like the idea of thinking of crossing boundaries, but as not just a movement that is neutral in itself, but that calls us into a place where we are transgressing something of the established norms. We are intentionally going against the grain, intentionally committing to move from one expression of who we are into a radically different expression of who we are called to be. And I'd like to offer the notion of transgression perhaps as something that you would want to take on as a value that defines Lincoln Diocese. Now, Bishop Nicholas, I'm not sure how well that will be received in the way in which you deal with the structural life of the diocese. But it's a transgression that is not iconoclastic and that is not designed to destroy, but it is transgression that is deeply committed to see the emergence of new patterns of relationship and new patterns of engagement with self, with the other, and the environment that we inhabit. Cultural intelligence, in many ways, is a lot more than simply the awareness of difference. It is more than just acquiring a set of knowledge about the other. In other words, it is an invitation to a posture of curiosity, and a curiosity that is not just factually based and factually informed and nurtured, but it's a curiosity that transacts in relationship. And so the key commodity that we will use in the development of cultural intelligence is trust. There is no possibility for the emergence of cultural intelligence without a commitment to invest trust in the other. And trust, as I often tell my colleagues who challenge me or us in their inability to journey towards another. And recently, as a church, we've been so caught up in the fracture of LLF. And many have suggested that we can't quite journey together because some of us have taken a particular act or have chosen to walk in a particular direction. And what I always say is that trust is not what the other do, but it's a choice that I make. And it's a commitment in my investment in the other. And so there is something in cultural intelligence that compels us to engage with a sense of personal agency and personal responsibility. It is ultimately about building and develop the capacity to adapt, to become resilient, but also leading towards effectivity in the way in which we relate and work with others. It's really interesting that in the world of business and industry, when they talk about cultural intelligence, so what they often argue about is that, or what the evidence suggests, is that having a diverse workforce does not in itself equip you to be effective in what you do. So the key element is having the right kind of value. So in other words, it's not about what you do, but it's about how you do it. It's not about the makeup of our body, or in other words, it's not about counting numbers, but it's about making numbers count. As a church, we have been plagued with the sin of racism that still visits us daily in many ways, and impacting our systems and our structures in a way that can only lead us to a place of lament. And there's been a real desire to see a shift in who we are as a church. So a lot of attention to iconography. By iconography, I don't simply mean the stained glass windows and the paintings that we have in our spaces of worship and our institutions, but actually how do we enable a multiplicity of voices and stories to be present within the spaces that we share. That in itself is good, but it doesn't quite do the task of leading us into a place that leads towards flourishing. The key thing is a kind of culture that we are able to develop and engender. Cultures in which we are rethinking and resetting the norms of power and the biases that shape the narratives that we create, particularly being attentive to the assumptions of normativity in our context and in our cultural normativity. People with cultural intelligence tend to be people who are not just knowledgeable of difference, but they are people who are intimately attuned to the values, to the beliefs, to the styles of communication of people from different contexts as well. They use this knowledge to help them relate to others in a way that demonstrates empathy, and in a way that enables the emergence and the building of relationship and trust. Why should cultural intelligence matter, you would ask? As I was saying earlier, studies demonstrate that in the industry, in businesses, the key factor in success for any organization is not the strategy that they develop, but rather the culture that they encourage to flourish. Now, perhaps a question for you, or maybe should I say for us. There's often the assumptions that when you are so embedded within a culture, you never have the capacity to recognize the culture that shapes and defines who you are. But someone who is typically an outsider or minoritized in your respective context will be able to articulate for you what that culture is. My friend that some of you may know, Elizabeth Henry, has often shared the story of a workshop that she was leading for L'Oréal, the cosmetic company. And as she was trying to help them to engage with the notion of culture, they resisted and argued that actually L'Oréal was not an organization with a rigid culture. If anything, they wanted to encourage freedom of expression and plurality in their institution. And then the next day, as they gathered for the next bit of the session, one of the participants asked whether she could intervene and make a comment. Then she shared that that evening she went back home and looked through her wardrobe and realized that every single item of clothing that she had was black. And she tried to think back as to what had happened and when was it that she changed her dress style. And she then picked up that when she first started working for L'Oréal, she used to wear colorful stuff. And without anyone telling her that when you work for L'Oréal, you need to dress in dark or black clothing, progressively she took the decision of changing her whole wardrobe in order to assimilate to an implicit culture that was shaping the normative expressions of what it meant to belong to that organization. Now, all of us are part of organizations with a strong cultural identity. Most of us are so embedded in it that we wouldn't be able, even with some help, to name it for what it is. I think the challenge of cultural intelligence is that it compels us to constantly rethink and reassess the normative cultures that we have set and their capacity to exclude, but also their capacity to be so driven by the tyranny of assimilation that anyone who comes near us can only survive, because there's no case of flourishing in that case, but they can only survive if they are prepared to assimilate to our ways of being. There is a narrowing of perspective. There is an oppressive way in which we inhabit that space. And ultimately, there is an inability to enable the flourishing of creativity, imagination, and ultimately of life. And where there isn't scope for the flourishing of life, we all know where it leads. It's atrophy, it's death. Well, it is true that we are resurrection people and we believe that death is the pathway to new life, but there is a kind of death that sometimes can be permanent, particularly in institutions and organizations that fail to curate spaces that are broad, embracing, and generous in their ethos. Just need to check timing, because I know that we are breaking for coffee at 11. I probably need to pause for a moment and just comment on the fact that as I say those things, I'm not speaking as one who's solved the question of cultural diversity or cultural intelligence. I speak as one who wrestles with it on a daily basis. And this is not a finger-pointing exercise. It's often dangerous when we enter into these spaces to try and assign blame and responsibility to one another. If anything, as I was saying earlier, this is an invitation, perhaps an opportunity for us to pick up tools that might expand our perspective, expand our vocabulary, and ultimately help us transform the cultures that we are setting so that they become inviting, generous, and deeply committed, not just to growth, but to flourishing, because that ultimately is divine purpose in creation. So, very briefly, a couple of key characteristics of culturally intelligent people or culturally intelligent organization. So people with high CQ are people who usually have figured out how to hold in balance and in creative tension which bit of them is core and which bit of them is flex. If you were to imagine a spectrum with core on one end and flex on the other, so there is a sense in which a culturally intelligent person has been able to hold in some balance, aspects of them that are core and aspects of them in which there is capacity for flexibility. Those things that are core to us can be expressed through our behaviors, through the values that we hold dear to, through the beliefs that we've got. And in many ways, they are those bits of ourselves that if they were to be changed, we would lose who we are. Those elements that are integral to our identity. And sometimes they are true across cultures, but each of us as individuals have got aspects of our character, of our person, of our story that are core. If anyone were to tinker with them, we would lose something of who we are. A few weeks ago, family was invited to share some food with friends from another faith tradition. And as we were eating, we were sharing stories about a variety of things. And then one of the guests, who was also part of that other faith tradition in which we were hosted, shared a particular story about how in terms, I think it was in relation to school admission, where they somehow were liberal with truth. And my wife, Miriam, then responded to them by saying, actually, I could never imagine myself doing that. And so in that case, what I heard Miriam express was not a judgment of value on the other person, but simply naming something of the core that made her who she is and that made me love her. For her, truth is monolithic in many ways, and there is no way in which she would, even when it works against her, move away from that. I remember when I lived in Brussels, I was renting a flat with my brother in a building that belonged to a landlord who was of Italian heritage. He had come to Belgium, I think in the 60s, and had made a life for himself and his family in that context. But what was really interesting is that despite the many decades that he'd lived in Belgium, somehow, though he had left Italy, and Sicily in his case, Sicily had never left him. There was so much about the way he engaged with life and the world that was so defined by his Sicilian identity. To such an extent that even engaging and conversing in French was not, because I mean we were in a Francophone speaking bit, was not something that he did with great joy. And there was some things in the way in which we relate to one another that occasionally led to some frictions. And later I realized that actually what it was is that he wasn't a complicated and a complex human being. It's just that there was something that was core to who he was. And in order for him to operate effectively, he had to be faithful to that core. And so the bigger your core is, the more inflexible one becomes. And the harder it could be to negotiate the dynamic of trust with others. Conversely, there is the sense in which if your flex is too big, takes too much space, you then fail to establish the right dynamic of trust. I mean, a good example is, I hope that no one is a car salesperson around here, or no one is intimately connected to one. But there is a sense that salespeople have got a huge flex, because what drives them is the capacity of convincing the other of the value of parting with a few pounds. And so salespeople would typically have a huge flex, to such an extent that most of us will be suspicious when we engage with them. We will not entrust them fully, partly because we have learned the hard lesson of falling into their traps. And so a bit of a caricature, but the sense that all of us actually have got a core and a flex. And cultural intelligence is the capacity of recognizing and naming those things that are essential to my identity, to my story. But not taking so much space that they then become an impediment in my capacity to be received or to receive the other, to engage creatively and life-affirmingly with different. Now I wonder, what are those things that are core to you, that are essential in your engagement with difference? And how much of it is enabling the building of relationship? And how much of it has occasionally become an impediment in enabling fruitful engagement with difference? Again, it would be helpful later on when we have our conversation to be able to draw, to come back on today's. So the greater gap there is between the flex and the core, the lesser capacity it has to enable a dynamic of cultural intelligence and therefore of positive engagement with difference. And the reality is that as we engage with our core, there will be times where we recognize that there are bits of our core that are so tightly invested and embedded in us that they require not just gentle massaging, but deep tissue engagement with it, rigorous engagement with it, in order to enable a loosening of some of that to facilitate engagement with another. But it could be also that some of those knots within our cores, we just can't deal with them. And if it is the case, perhaps wisdom is make sure that we don't make it someone else's problem, but our own responsibility and our own problem as we engage with it. I was saying earlier that there is in cultural intelligence a compulsion towards a space that is deeply fluid, that is constantly moving. I remember a few months ago, I was attending two different churches for a confirmation service and baptism. And both those churches were having baptism with immersion, and so I had to kind of go up dressed up appropriately for that as I was going to get into the water. And in conversation with both of those churches, we explored the question of vestments. And I found that neither of those churches used vestments. And so as I went to the second church, one person who attended both services sent a message to a common friend, and the message was not destined to me, but somehow accidentally was delivered to me, where she was commenting on the chino trousers that I was wearing. And later on, we had a bit of a laugh about it. But what it transpired in exchange, is that there was something for her about what one wore that was core, that was essential. There was very little room for negotiation in her approach. And I understood also that for me, what I wear is not part of my core, it's part of my flex. And so it is imperative for me, in whatever context that I find myself, not to determine the quality of my engagement with people on the basis of whether their dress code fits with my expectations of what is acceptable, and that I am able to create flexibility and fluidity in the way in which I relate to what I and others wear. But equally, I need to understand that for some people, in some of the contexts in which I go, what I wear is essential because it is part of their core. And therefore, it is imperative to me that I honor their expectations. And it is not a case of diminishing my values, but it's recognizing that good human interaction for me is part of my core. And I will be ready to sacrifice aspects of my flex in order to build those life-affirming relationships. So as you test your core, be attentive of the knots, those areas of resistance, those bits that are standing in the way of healthy and fluid relationships. And as you attend to them, you might also want to avail yourself to the wisdom of the other. And this is where we shift from cultural intelligence to what is often referred to as cultural humility. So if cultural intelligence is knowledge-based, cultural humility in many ways is framed around a posture and a value that one takes in relation to the other. It's recognizing that knowing something about a given culture is not enough. It is also recognizing that as I engage with a different culture, I do so from particular lenses that define me as a person. It also means that there is never a neutral ways in which I encounter the other. The spaces of encounter are always saturated with our biases. It therefore means that I am never a specialist of your story, but you are the specialist of your narrative and your story. And as I engage with you, I need the humility to recognize that only you can teach me about who you are. It is about recognizing and naming the imbalance of social power that we carry in every encounter. And recognizing that for me, for instance, as I enter into a conversation with a clergy colleague or a member of one of our congregation, the very fact that they address me as bishop implies what's the word? An imbalance, an asymmetry in the power that sets that encounter. It also means that in our white Western context, there is something about the imbued and implicit power that you as white British people carry in every encounter that you've got with someone who is not white British. Partly because this is your society. This is where you host us in some ways. And if we are committed to life-affirming relationships, then we need to add to cultural intelligence, cultural humility, the capacity of recognizing that the other is the expert in their story, and the other needs the agency to formulate their needs, their aspirations, their identity without being caricatured, without being reduced to cheap and easy stereotypes. It is demanding because it constantly requires me to question myself and constantly requires me to consider the very location of my person in any interaction. There is something about Church of England that assumes a cultural normativity, and a cultural normativity that is often oppressive to anyone who doesn't quite fit the mold of what it means to be an Anglican. A cultural normativity that also demands assimilation into the ways in which we are church and the ways in which we do church. Such an approach in a world that is increasingly plural and diverse will lead to the atrophy of the church and ultimately to its decline. And the remedy for us is the capacity to create spaces in which we are able to name the fault lines that we inhabit. We are able to name the imbalance of power that people hold as they come together in spaces. To name also the possibility of an alternative narrative that will be neither your story or my story, but a third way in which we collectively are able to create and shape a new way of being, a new way of relating, where belonging becomes the norm, not just inclusion. There is also something about recognizing that we are a Eucharistic people. And as a Eucharistic people, we are all guests at the Lord's table. So therefore, if we are all guests at the Lord's table, no one has got the burden of hospitality. No one should feel that this is a space in which they are welcoming others. but actually all of us are being welcomed on an equal footing by Christ. And we are gathered around a table that reminds us of our brokenness, but that also invites us into a place of healing and restoration, where we become a new people, transformed and restored. And around that table, we are invited to become the heralds of a new way of telling the story of God to a world that is longing to belong, that is longing to be healed, a world that is dying to be heard, dying to be restored. I think the church is in a privileged position and has got a powerful opportunity to be able to offer society with a new perspective, a new language in the way in which we speak of belonging, of identity and otherness, where we can move from exclusion to embrace, where we can move from fracture to reconciliation, where we can move from a hoarding of power and resources to a distribution that is generous in its posture of all that God does, but also a place where each and every one of us are given the dignity of a name, an identity that is not framed simply in caricature, but where each and every one of us is enabled to fully belong to one another in a way that affirms their identity and affirms their story. Part of that task will mean that those of us in position of privilege and power will need to constantly examine the way in which we show up in those spaces. It will mean that there will be a task of giving away, which is what cultural intelligence and cultural humility compels us to. Giving away those very things that stand as an obstacle towards reconciliation, towards flourishing. Now, it isn't an easy one. And I suspect that it is a task that is not achieved across one generation, but one that compels us to labor actively towards God's future. We walk towards it and we walk from it. I'll stop there and I look forward to our conversation in about half an hour or so. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of your own wisdom and insight. Thank you.